I never thought I'd become the kind of person who could casually say, "Yeah, I committed a crime." Growing up, I always imagined criminals as loud people, reckless people, the sort who smashed windows or waved guns around. I had this neat little mental picture where evil announced itself before entering the room. Turns out that's complete nonsense. The sentence that still lives in my head came from a man named Victor years ago. He said it over coffee while flipping through paperwork like it bored him to death. "A false expert opinion is a conclusion written before the inspection." He laughed after saying it. I remember that part more than the words themselves. Like he just shared a joke nobody else understood. At the time I laughed too, because I thought he was being cynical about bureaucracy. I didn't realize he'd handed me the first brick of a road I'd eventually walk all the way down. Back then I was 32, broke in the kind of way that feels personal. Not, "Can't buy a new phone." Broke. I mean counting coins for gas money, pretending I wasn't hungry because skipping dinner sounded more dignified than admitting I couldn't afford it. I was working contract jobs, temporary assessments, paperwork, odd consulting work, enough to survive, never enough to breathe. Then my father got sick. Funny thing about desperation, it doesn't arrive dramatically. No thunder, no music. It shows up as numbers on bills. Hospital forms. Missed calls. Late payment notices. I kept telling myself I just needed one break. Just one. And eventually one showed up. The problem was that it wasn't an opportunity. It was a crime wearing an opportunity's face. A week after that conversation, Victor called me out of nowhere. I almost ignored it because I barely knew him beyond occasional work and coffee breaks. He wasn't a friend. He was one of those people who always seemed connected to everyone, the guy who somehow knew lawyers, contractors, mechanics, inspectors, and half the city's gray areas. He asked if I wanted easy money. People always say that's a red flag, but reality is less dramatic. He didn't whisper. He didn't sound shady. He sounded bored, like he was asking whether I wanted lunch. We met in a small cafe near an industrial district. I remember rain tapping against the windows and Victor sliding a folder toward me. "Property damage assessment," he said. I looked through photographs of cracked walls and water damage. "What about it?" He smiled. "The report already knows what it's going to say. It just needs someone willing to write it." I stared at him. Then I asked the question that still bothers me. "How much?" I wish I could tell you I immediately stood up and walked away. That would make me sound better than I was. Instead, I sat there pretending to think while my answer had already started forming somewhere in the back of my mind. Victor explained it in broad strokes. An insurance dispute. A damaged property. Conflicting claims. Someone needed an expert opinion that leaned in a very specific direction. Not a complete fantasy, he said, just adjusting the interpretation. Funny how people rename things when they need to sleep at night. I spent the next few days arguing with myself. I kept building tiny defenses in my head. Banks cheat people. Companies cheat people. Everybody bends rules. I recycled every excuse I could find. Then I opened my father's medical bills again. That was the moment things shifted. Not because I suddenly became evil. Because I stopped asking, "Is this wrong?" I started asking, "Can I live with it?" Preparation started before I admitted to myself that I'd already agreed. Victor sent me documents, photographs, prior reports, architectural plans, insurance correspondence, enough paperwork to make the whole thing feel official. That was the dangerous part. Crime in movies looks dramatic. Crime in real life often looks like spreadsheets and PDFs. I told myself I was just reviewing material. Then I started highlighting sections. Then taking notes. Then comparing earlier assessments. Without noticing, I'd crossed a line from curiosity into participation. The report needed to conclude that structural damage had been caused by a recent construction incident nearby rather than long-term neglect. That distinction meant a huge payout. I studied previous inspection language online and copied the rhythm of professional reports, cautious wording, technical phrases, observations that sounded objective. I even made myself a checklist. Dates, photos, measurements, terminology, consistency. Reading that list now makes me uncomfortable because I wasn't preparing to commit some chaotic crime. I was preparing to look credible. The inspection itself was scheduled for 3 days later, and that's when reality finally started pressing against me. Until then, everything had been documents and screens. Abstract things. Safe things. Now I actually had to walk into a building and pretend I belonged there. I prepared obsessively. I read engineering terminology I barely understood and watched videos explaining structural stress fractures, water intrusion patterns, and foundation movement. I practiced phrases out loud in my apartment like an actor memorizing lines. Possible load-related displacement. Evidence appears consistent with external influence. I sounded ridiculous. But repetition creates confidence, or at least a convincing imitation of confidence. I also thought through small details people forget. What would I wear? How long should I examine a wall before writing notes? Would confident people move quickly or slowly? I even bought a new notebook. That detail bothers me for some reason. Because somewhere between buying a notebook and rehearsing fake expertise, I stopped feeling like William playing a role. I started feeling like William becoming someone else. The day of the inspection arrived cold and gray, the kind of weather that makes buildings look more tired than they really are. I got there early because I thought being late would make me seem careless. Instead, arriving early just gave me more time to panic. The property itself looked ordinary, an aging commercial building with hairline cracks in places and water stains along sections of the walls. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed disaster. Victor was already there talking with 2 people near the entrance. One of them owned the property. The other represented the insurance side. I remember shaking hands and immediately wondering if mine felt sweaty. Then the owner said something I wasn't prepared for. Glad they finally sent someone who knows what they're doing. I smiled automatically. Inside, I felt my stomach drop. Because suddenly this wasn't paperwork anymore. A stranger had looked directly at me and seen an expert. And I knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at a fraud. We walked through the building room by room, and I kept doing what I had practiced. Pause, observe, write something down, nod thoughtfully. The weird thing was that people started reacting exactly the way I hoped they would. Confidence is unsettlingly powerful. I'd crouch near a crack in the wall, narrow my eyes for a few seconds, and immediately everyone around me went quiet like I was decoding hidden truths from concrete. Then something happened that I hadn't planned for. A maintenance supervisor joined us halfway through the inspection. He was older, maybe late 50s, and unlike everyone else, he wasn't trying to impress me. He looked at the walls, looked at me, then asked a few technical questions. Simple questions. At least they sounded simple. My mind froze instantly. I answered with vague language and professional-sounding nonsense. He kept staring at me for another second. Then he nodded slowly. And somehow that felt worse than if he'd openly called me a liar. The worst moment came in the basement. Upstairs I could survive on posture and vague language, but down there the maintenance supervisor suddenly pointed at a section of exposed concrete and asked for my opinion on a fracture line running along the wall. Everybody looked at me. I remember hearing pipes humming somewhere overhead and water dripping in the distance. Tiny sounds. Somehow they became absurdly loud. I walked over slowly, buying time. I crouched beside the crack and stared at it like I was studying something complicated, when in reality my brain was racing through half-remembered phrases from videos I'd watched at 2 in the morning. Then I said it. I talked about external stress transfer and possible secondary load effects. Complete nonsense mixed with real terminology. Silence. The supervisor looked down again, scratched his jaw, and finally shrugged. Maybe. Maybe. That single word felt like surviving a car crash. Everyone moved on. But for the first time all day, I started thinking less about money and more about how badly this could end. After the inspection ended, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The report itself became the real crime. Because now I was alone. No walking through hallways. No pretending in front of people. No Victor standing nearby. Just me, my apartment, and a blank document waiting for me to decide exactly how dishonest I wanted to be. I sat in front of my laptop for almost an hour without typing anything. Then I started slowly. Observations first. Measurements. Descriptions. Neutral things. Things I actually saw. But eventually I reached the conclusion section. That was where the line lived. I kept staring at the cursor blinking on the screen. A false expert opinion is a conclusion written before the inspection. I heard Victor's voice in my head saying it again. The terrifying part wasn't writing lies from nothing. It was taking pieces of truth and bending them just enough that they still looked real. I finished at nearly 3 a.m. Then I signed my name under it. The morning after I sent the report, I expected relief. Instead, I felt this strange emptiness, like I had been running for hours and suddenly stopped moving. I kept checking my phone for no reason. Every notification made my chest tighten. 2 days later, Victor called. He sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. Good work, he said. Everything's moving. Then he mentioned the amount I'd be paid. I remember staring out my apartment window while he talked because the number barely felt real. It was more money than I had seen in a long time. Enough to cover bills. Enough to help my father. Enough to make excuses sound reasonable. I should have felt happy. Instead, I felt something uglier. Because part of me wasn't relieved about the money. Part of me felt proud. Proud that I'd pulled it off. That realization hit harder than guilt did. Lying once scared me. Discovering I was capable of enjoying success afterwards scared me a lot more. About a week later, I started believing I had escaped it. That's when life decided to remind me how arrogance works. I got a call from an unknown number while I was grocery shopping. I almost ignored it, but I answered anyway. A calm voice introduced himself and said he was reviewing documentation connected to the property claim. Reviewing documentation. Such harmless words. Then he asked if I had time to discuss a few details from my assessment. I stopped moving immediately. People walked around me pushing shopping carts while I stood there holding a loaf of bread like an idiot. He wasn't accusing me of anything. That was the problem. He sounded casual. Professional. He asked about measurements I'd taken and certain observations written in my report. Suddenly I couldn't remember what I'd invented and what I'd actually seen. I started talking carefully, buying time, trying to sound relaxed. By the end of the call he thanked me politely. Then he said, "We may need additional clarification later." That short phone call destroyed me for the next several days. Nothing happened. That was the worst part. No police at my door. No dramatic confrontation. No angry messages. Just silence. My brain filled the empty space on its own. Every car stopping outside my apartment made me look through the blinds. Every unknown number felt dangerous. At night I replayed the inspection in my head and searched for mistakes I might have made. Did the maintenance supervisor suspect something? Did I use terminology incorrectly? Did I contradict another report without noticing? I even opened my own document and reread it repeatedly. Huge mistake. The more I read it, the less familiar it felt. I started seeing places where I'd stretched facts too far, places where confidence had replaced accuracy. Then I did something pathetic. I called Victor. I expected concern. Instead he laughed. "William, relax. Nervous people create problems. Calm people survive them." For some reason that sentence made me feel worse instead of better. A few days after talking to Victor, I got called into a follow-up meeting. Not an interrogation. Not officially. Just a meeting. I kept repeating that to myself while getting dressed that morning. The room was smaller than I expected. A table, some documents, coffee that smelled burnt, and 3 people already sitting there. Nobody looked angry. Nobody looked dramatic. That somehow made everything worse. They asked me to explain sections of my report and clarify certain technical conclusions. At first I managed to stay composed. I repeated ideas I had already memorized and kept my voice steady. Then one of them slid a photograph across the table. A basement wall. The same crack. He pointed at it. Can you explain why your report attributes this to recent external stress when earlier maintenance records describe progressive deterioration over several years? I looked at the picture. And for a few seconds my mind simply stopped working. People imagine panic as something explosive. It wasn't. For me it felt like falling through ice. Everything around me stayed normal, while inside my head something collapsed. I looked at the photograph, then at the maintenance records they placed beside it. Dates. Previous inspections. Repair notes. Years of documented issues. I knew immediately what had happened. The maintenance supervisor. Either he had submitted records later or someone had decided to check more carefully than Victor expected. I started talking anyway. I tried explaining that conclusions and assessments sometimes evolve with additional context. I said interpretations can vary. I buried simple ideas under layers of complicated wording. I could actually hear myself doing it. And I hated it. Because I wasn't trying to explain the truth anymore. I was trying to survive. One of them sat quietly through all of it, then finally said, "Mr. William, we're less interested in mistakes than intentional misrepresentation." I swear my heartbeat became loud enough to hear. I wasn't arrested that day. People usually expect handcuffs at the end of stories like this, but reality dragged things out in slow, ugly stages. Investigations, interviews, paperwork, lawyers, months of waiting while every day felt like standing under a storm cloud. Victor disappeared almost immediately. Calls stopped. Messages went unanswered. Amazing how quickly people vanish when responsibility starts looking for them. Eventually I admitted what I'd done. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Enough truth at first to protect myself, then more truth because I got tired of carrying it. My father never found out the whole story. I still don't know whether I'm grateful for that or ashamed of it. What changed most wasn't my record or my finances. It was the way I saw myself. I learned something I wish I'd understood earlier. Most people don't become dangerous in one moment. They become dangerous one justification at a time. If you're standing at that first excuse, turn around. It's a shorter walk back than forward.